Hello, everyone. My name is Davis Musnix, and today I'm going to be discussing sustainable energy. So, before I get into everything, I want to go into a brief history about how us as humankind have obtained our energy. So, before the industrial era, humans relied on biomass such as wood or dung and muscle power for the most part, human labor, animal labor for energy. Wind and water mills were used for grinding grain and irrigation. And then around the 18th and 19th century, the Industrial Revolution went into play, and the widespread use of coal and the invention of the steam engine revolutionized industry, transportation, and manufacturing. And this led to rapid economic growth. And then we had kind of an oil boom in the late 19th, early 20th century. The development of electricity generation, including hydroelectric and coal fired power plants, really transformed daily life. Oil and gas became the true dominant energy sources powering cars, industry, and homes. And this is really what our modern system is based around is oil, natural gas, things of that sort. And then the mid 20th century, nuclear energy was introduced. It was discovered, and it was able to be harvested. Excuse me. And the discovery of nuclear power provided an alternative to fossil fuels, but people ended up getting concerned about pollution, climate change, and they opted to move towards more renewable sources such as solar power and wind power, which is 21st century present. That's where we're at now. Solar and wind power is in the works of being implemented. And yeah, that's a brief history of energy. One thing I wanted to touch on some drawbacks of oil. I mentioned that our society is primarily dominated by oil power. A large problem with using oil is the fact that oil leads to conflict. It's a fossil fuel, it's a very limited resource, very sought after resource. And there has been many conflicts for possession of oil. And I think that one of the greatest examples of this was the war in Iraq, the American war in Iraq in 2003. I found a quote that says that the outcome was not inevitable in this war. The United States has not only been mired in the middle, but its approach to oil has also abetted the outcome. Essentially, what this is saying is that this war was, although this wasn't officially stated, a significant chunk of why the war went the way that it did was because of oil and the United States' desire for the oil in the Middle East. And on top of that, our current power system leads to greenhouse gas emissions, which furthers climate change, and also water pollution, as you can see on this image in the bottom right. There have been oil spills in the ocean. Our ocean has literally been on fire, which is ridiculous. That shouldn't be happening. And if we continue going on the way that we are, this earth is not going to be in great shape. So, that being said, I believe that we as a society need to take action. And I want to make note of how complex this issue really can get. There are many variables to be considered, including the economic burden or benefit of a proposed solution. Things can't just happen for free. Changes can't be made for free. Somebody needs to get paid along the way. And it needs to be considered, how much are these projects going to cost? Is it going to end up costing consumers more than what we have now? Are they going to be happy with that? Are they going to be upset? Things of that nature. We also need to worry about disrupting nature, right? Because wind turbines, hydroelectric power, that can interfere with natural processes. Wind turbines can interfere with birds flying. Hydroelectric power can interfere with the flow of water streams, which can disrupt, say, beavers, for example. So we need to consider the fact that we may be disrupting nature with our solutions. We also need to think about the use of natural resources in the construction of these projects, because solar panels, they need to be built with very specific materials, right? And we need to make sure that those resources are renewable, sustainable. We also need to make sure that in an energy reliant society, one that we're in right now, we need to make sure that our sources are efficient, right? Because if our solution isn't filling the shoes of what we had before, everything's going to come crashing down. We also need to think about the power grid and the way that that's set up. The way the power grid kind of works is it's centered around power plants, typically coal or oil power plants. And so we need to think about land use. Will wind turbines, for example, need to use more land than a power plant would? And the answer is yes. We'll get into that. But this use of land, if it's going to be a big, big wind power plant, then we need to think about, oh, well, now we have to move around things and allocate more room, things of that nature. We also need to think about the longevity, right? Because if a solar panel, this isn't true, but just imagine that a solar panel had a lifespan of 10 years, that would be a large, large issue that we need to address. We need to make sure that what we put in place can last as long as what we already have in place and can last into the coming years. So, I'm going to touch on renewable energy. When I say renewable energy, I'm talking about solar, wind, and hydropower. These are all things that we are currently working on implementing in the modern day and age. A lot of people have concerns about efficiency, and it can be said that despite being one of the least financially burdening options in this scenario, the energy yield of solar energy largely depends on weather patterns of where it's implemented. And that being said, it's not really reliable enough to be considered a universal solution to the problem. I did some research into this subject, and yeah, in certain areas of the continental United States, there tend to be lower wind trends, which would make wind turbines not a viable option in those areas. So we need to consider that. We need to figure out workarounds for that. In addition, startup costs. Wind turbines aren't easy to put up, they cost a lot of money. We need to think about that. We also need to think about intermittency. Say there's an area that doesn't get a lot of sunshine. We need to think about, okay, well, if we have solar panels, will they end up being able to fuel all the time? Will they be able to harvest enough energy to make up for the times where it is cloudy? That kind of thing. Also, like I touched on earlier, power grid integration. We need to think about land use and the fact that some of these things take up a lot more land than a power plant would. And also ecosystem concerns. Like I said earlier, intervention with a flowing river, intervention with migration patterns of birds. These are all somewhat issues that we need to think about when we think about implementing this. So, my final thoughts regarding renewable energy are in some places, yes, this can happen. In other places, maybe it's too cloudy or it's not windy enough. We need to think about what else can we do, right? That being said, I'm going to move on to nuclear or atomic energy. Now, nuclear energy is nuclear fission, which is the result of radioactive materials being decayed at fast rates. And there's very little volume needed to achieve nuclear power, which is why I think it's a viable alternative to coal. For example, there's a large volume of coal needed to be burned in order to achieve the same energy as just a little bit of uranium. And that can be said about oil too. Small volumes are needed, and there's large reserves of nuclear fuel such as uranium worldwide. The emissions that you see from the smokestacks, although they may look scary, it's just water vapor. There are no greenhouse gases being produced during a nuclear fission reaction. Nothing like that. Also, power grid integration. These things, they are pretty big, but not nearly as big as a field of wind turbines. And since they're similar enough to the size of a coal or oil plant, they could be more easily integrated into the power grid. Also, a lot of people worry about the disposal of radioactive waste. I just wanted to say that safe disposal of this waste does exist. It's not green sludge like people are led to believe in cartoons. And there's actually great methods that we have in place for getting rid of this stuff. Some of the drawbacks are there is a large startup cost with a nuclear power plant. These things are massive. They take lots of resources to build. Not to mention staffing them gets expensive. People who work at these plants, they get paid a healthy amount. And that being said, it costs a lot to keep these things up. Another thing that people worry about, the accidents such as the Chernobyl accident happening again. I wanted to touch on the fact that a lot of people have this notion that it's very, very, very risky and it's common and it could easily happen. Did some research into that and found that, and I quote, the immediate cause of the Chernobyl accident was a turbine test that went wrong. Its deeper roots lay in the interaction between major flaws in the Soviet political system and major flaws in the nuclear industry. Roberts 2020. What this is saying essentially is that even though it was a mistake and things did go wrong, a lot of that can be blamed on the fact that Soviet infrastructure wasn't the best. Not to mention that this was about 40 years ago now when this happened, and the technology has improved significantly since then, which is something that I found when I did further research. And although it remains a possibility, which is why I have it as a drawback, it's not as probable as the public likes to believe. In conclusion, I think that a combination of these two energy sources, both renewable sources and nuclear energy, needs to be advertised for public support and implemented through Congress, right? Because although renewable energy is viable in some areas, it may not be viable in others. And where renewable energy lacks, I think nuclear energy can pick up that slack with minimum repercussions to the environment, to the public, to this planet. And here are my references. That's all I have for you guys. Thank you for your time.